Some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Sharif Abdel-Qaddous.
And welcome, everyone. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said Tuesday that the United States is open to the idea of keeping American troops in Iraq past the 2011 deadline for withdrawal. Speaking in Malaysia, Gates added that the request would have to come from the Iraqi government. He noted that any talks on the issue would have to wait until Iraqi leaders agreed to a power-sharing deal and ended the long stalemate that has followed parliamentary elections in March. Meanwhile, inside Iraq, there's been little respite from the violence in recent weeks. On Monday, bomb attacks on Shia Muslim targets in 3 Iraqi cities left at least 19 people dead and many more injured. Last week, a deadly siege by gunmen in a Catholic church in Baghdad left 52 dead. Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki visited the Our Lady of Salvation Church on Tuesday.
Despite the pain we feel from such a huge attack, we will not be subjected to their will. Yesterday was Karbala, Najaf, and Basra, and so they will continue on with their attacks. Their means are a combination of hatred and political motives to hinder the political process and block the reconstruction of the country.
Here in the United States, former President George W. Bush has defended his decision to attack Iraq in 2003. In his first major interview since leaving office, Bush spoke to NBC's Matt Lauer as part of a promotional campaign around his memoir, Decision Points.
So by the time you gave the order to start military operations in Iraq, did you personally have any doubt, any shred of doubt about that intelligence?
No, I didn't. I really didn't.
Not everybody thought you should go to war, though. There were dissenters.
Of course there were.
Did you filter them out?
I was a dissenting voice. I didn't want to use force.
Your words. No one was more sickened or angry than I was when we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. You still have a sickening feeling.
I do.
When you think about it.
I do.
Was there ever any consideration of apologizing to the American people?
I mean, apologizing would basically say the decision was a wrong decision, and I don't believe it was a wrong decision.
If you knew then what you know now,
that's right,
you would still go to war in Iraq.
I, first of all, didn't have that luxury. You just don't have the luxury when you're president. I will say, definitely, the world is better off without Saddam Hussein in power, as are 25 million people who now have a chance to live in freedom.
That was President Bush. Well, for more on Iraq as well as Afghanistan and U.S. involvement in other parts of the Middle East, we're joined here in New York by independent journalist Nir Rosen. His latest book is called Aftermath, Following the Bloodshed of America's Wars in the Muslim World. Nir Rosen is also a fellow at New York University's Center on Law and Security. Welcome to Democracy Now! Let's start with President Bush's words.
Oh, what's he going to say? This is a man whose legacy is Iraq. But he said that 25 million Iraqis are better off. Certainly the hundreds of thousands of dead Iraqis are not better off. Their families aren't better off. The tens of thousands of Iraqi men who languished in American and subsequently Iraqi gulags are not better off. The children who lost their fathers aren't better off. The millions of Iraqis who lost their homes, hundreds of thousands of refugees in the region are not better off. So there's no mathematical calculation you can make to determine who's better off and who's not.
He said Saddam Hussein is gone.
Saddam Hussein is gone, that's true. The regime we've put in place is certainly more representative, but it's brutal and authoritarian. Torture is routine and systematic. Corruption is also routine and systematic. There are no services to speak of, no real electricity or water. Violence remains very high. So there's nothing to be proud of in this. The Iraqi people deserve much better, and they're the real victims of Bush's war.
And what's happening right now in Iraq? There's been a long stalemate following the parliamentary elections in March. You were in Iraq many times since 2003, and you documented very closely, for example, Muqtada al-Sadr and the Mahdi army. Where does he fit into all of this, and where does the Iraqi government fit into the picture today?
Well, Iraq today, and in the future, I think, will look more and more like Mexico or Pakistan, in that you're going to have a strong central regime, a little bit authoritarian, certainly corrupt, brutal security forces. But strong. Nobody can overthrow it. Nobody's threatening to overthrow it. No more real militia activity. And terrible violence, which just becomes normal, much as it is in Mexico or Pakistan. A violence which doesn't threaten the new order, but certainly threatens the lives of many civilians on a regular basis, and people have to adjust to that and live their lives accordingly. Prime Minister Maliki is going to remain. He was always going to remain. There was never any question. When you're in power, why would you give up power? And the Americans have been backing him since at least August. And indeed, he's probably the least worst candidate in that he has at least the support of some countries in the region, and of the majority of the Iraqi people to some extent. He does have a certain amount of legitimacy. He's credited, rightly or wrongly, with the reduction in violence that began in 2008 when he went after the Shia militias. So the Sadrists are much maligned, but they are the largest, perhaps they're the only grassroots movement in Iraq, and the largest real movement, a real party.
Explain who they are.
They are a Shia movement which represents the poor, dispossessed, angry, and marginalized Shias of Iraq. This is a class of sort of revolutionary a class which in the 50s and 60s supported communism, was anti-establishment, and the voice of that anger in the 90s and certainly post-American invasion has been the Sadrists, a religious movement which is more or less anti-establishment, anti-federalist, was very much anti-occupation, was part of the resistance, but also played a major role as a Shia self-defense militia that got drawn more and more into the civil war and became more and more implicated in brutality, first against Sunnis and even against Shia civilians. They were finally crushed by a combination of Prime Minister Maliki's forces and the American military in 2008. So now they remain a real serious movement. The only one which even talks about improvement of services and social issues. At the same time, they always have that implied threat of the ability to return to their militia activity. They were associated with Iran because they were marginalized. They ended up looking to Iran for support. And suddenly some of their units were trained by the Iranians to be better able to blow up American vehicles, have better aim with their mortars. These days it's no longer an issue anymore because the occupation is sort of mostly a non-issue. But it looks like they're going to be integrated into the government in the new coalition, which has been controversial. I maintain that that's a good thing, that you want them in the system. When they were marginalized, they were pushed to violence and acted as spoilers. But when they're in the establishment, when they're part of the government, it's very difficult to be anti-establishment when you're in the establishment. It's very difficult to try to undermine the system when you have to deal with mundane things like improving sewage services and electricity and things like that. And you don't want this group of people who historically have been marginalized from Iraq to continue to feel marginalized.
You're saying they, but Muqtada al-Sadr, explain what happened to him.
He was the son of Mohammad Sadiq Sadr, an Ayatollah that was allegedly assassinated in 1999 by Saddam's agents, although nobody really knows who did it. And he didn't have, Muqtada, a high level of clerical education, but that wasn't really the point of his popularity. It was more that he was the son of this important family, and that he spoke in this sort of common Iraqi accent and expressed the anger of this sort of revolutionary class of Shias. And when he was angry, he was popular. To the extent that he stopped being angry, he would often lose popularity. He was pushed in 2007 to seek exile in Iran, and where he's allegedly studying to be an Ayatollah, which will give him more clerical authority. But he remains the single most popular individual among most Shias, although he's reviled by many Sunnis because they blame the Mahdi army for its sectarianism. Obviously, the Americans have a grudge against him as well because his forces were involved in attacking the American occupation. And it appears that he's biding his time, waiting for the right moment to return to Iraq, where he won't assume a political role, but he'll be a very important symbolic leader of this movement.
And in a moment, we're going to play a clip of President Bush. He also spoke about the surge. This has been talked about as the great success of the American occupation of Iraq, is ending the civil war. But I wanted to ask you first about the civil war. This is how you start your book, and part one of your book you call the Lebanonization of Iraq. What do you mean by that term, and how did the civil war really take hold in Iraq?
By Lebanonization of Iraq, I mean that sectarian identity became more and more important and the key to attaining power. And sectarian groups were pitted against each other, much as we see in Lebanon. Now, in Lebanon, it's more of a formal structure. In Iraq, it was just a sort of became that way. Although the Americans did introduce certain sectarian quotas into the original sort of puppet governing council they established. And this was very disturbing to Iraqis because they had never thought of themselves primarily as Sunni or Shia, and that had never been the overt primary way in which you would attain power. So in the summer of 2003, when the Americans began to institute this kind of official sectarianism and institutionalize it, you had Iraqis warning the Americans are trying to create a civil war. Now, they weren't actually trying